At 19, Evelyn Preston was handed a garbage bag of clothes and left on the side of a frozen Colorado highway by her own father. Her revenge didn't start with a grand scheme. It started with a crumpled $1 bill, a condemned building, and a rusted, locked Mosler safe. To understand how a 19-year-old girl ends up buying a toxic, decaying commercial property for the price of a cheap cup of coffee, you first have to understand the sheer weight of the Preston family name. Richard Preston was a titan of Boston real estate, a man who viewed his properties and his children through the exact same lens: assets to be leveraged. Evelyn was supposed to be the ultimate asset. Groomed for high society, she was expected to marry the son of a prominent zoning commissioner, effectively securing her father's monopoly over the city's waterfront development. But Evelyn possessed a stubborn, fiery independence that refused to be collateral in a boardroom deal. When she definitively called off the arranged engagement on a Tuesday evening in November, the fallout was apocalyptic. There was no shouting, which made it worse. Richard simply walked to his desk, canceled her credit cards, revoked her trust fund, and gave her 20 minutes to pack what she could fit into a single black trash bag. By midnight, she was sitting in the driver's seat of her rusted 1998 Subaru Outback, the only thing strictly in her name, driving west, with $42 in cash and a chest full of shattered trust. 3 days later, the Subaru's transmission violently died on the outskirts of Creede, Colorado, a historic mining town nestled deep in the San Juan Mountains. The temperature was hovering at 5 degrees. Evelyn trudged 2 miles through driving sleet to the only place with its lights on, a greasy spoon called the Copper Diner. She sat in a vinyl booth, nursing a black coffee she could barely afford, shivering in a thin peacoat. It was here, at the lowest point of her life, that fate arrived wearing muddy boots and a faded flannel shirt. His name was Arthur Pendleton, an 82-year-old local who was currently shouting at the waitress about property taxes. "I'm telling you, Brenda, the city council is trying to bleed me dry." Arthur slammed a stack of yellowed, coffee-stained papers onto the counter. $4,000 in back taxes and abatement fees for a building that's been boarded up since the Truman administration. They want to seize it and bulldoze it for a parking lot. I'd rather burn it to the ground than give Mayor Higgins the satisfaction. Evelyn listened, her survival instincts suddenly overriding her exhaustion. She didn't know real estate, but she knew her father's tactics. Municipalities seizing historic properties for cheap commercial redevelopment was Richard Preston's playbook. She slid out of her booth and approached the old man. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Though whether from the cold or the audacity of what she was about to say, she wasn't sure. "What building?" Arthur eyed her suspiciously. "The old Silver Queen assay office on the edge of town. Been in my family since 1912. The roof is shot, the floorboards are rot, and the EPA says there's probably heavy metals in the soil. It's a curse. Sell it to me," Evelyn said flatly. The diner went dead silent. The waitress paused with a coffee pot in midair. Arthur let out a bark of a laugh. "Girl, do you have $4,000 to pay the back taxes? Because if you don't, the county takes it on Friday. Today is Wednesday." "I don't have $4,000, Evelyn admitted, lifting her chin. "But I have $1. And if you sell it to me, Mayor Higgins doesn't get to seize it from you. He has to seize it from a 19-year-old girl who just rolled into town with nothing but a broken car. It ties it up in probate and out-of-state residency legalities for at least 6 months. You spite the mayor, you wash your hands of the liability, and I get a roof over my head for tonight." Arthur stared at her. He saw the desperation in her eyes, but he also saw a hardened, calculating edge that mirrored the unforgiving mountain landscape outside. Slowly, a wicked grin spread across the old man's weathered face. "You got a pen, kid?" Right there on the sticky laminate counter, Arthur drafted a makeshift quitclaim deed. Evelyn reached into her pocket, pulled out a crinkled $1 bill featuring George Washington, and slid it across the table. In exchange, Arthur handed her a heavy, rusted iron key. "It's at the end of Canyon Road," Arthur warned, his tone turning surprisingly gentle. "There's no power, no water. But there is a wood stove in the back office, and some dry cordwood under the tarp out back. Don't freeze to death, kid." When Evelyn finally found the Silver Queen assay office in the dying light of the afternoon, her heart sank. The building was a decaying Victorian relic. Its false front was leaning precariously, the paint completely stripped away by a century of brutal alpine winds. The windows were boarded up with decaying plywood. She turned the iron key in the padlock. The heavy wooden door screamed on its hinges as she pushed it open. The smell hit her instantly, a heavy, suffocating mix of dry rot, ancient dust, and the metallic tang of chemical ash. Using the flashlight on her dying phone, she navigated the debris. The front room was a disaster of overturned wooden counters and shattered glass. But she found the back office Arthur had mentioned. True to his word, a cast-iron wood stove sat in the corner. That night, huddled by a modest fire, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, Evelyn Preston wept. She cried for the life she had lost, the father who didn't love her, and the terrifying reality of her situation. But as the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper, her tears stopped. She was the sole owner of the Silver Queen assay office. It was a ruin, but it was hers. Tomorrow, she would figure out how to survive. Morning broke with a harsh, blinding glare reflecting off the snow outside. Evelyn woke up stiff and freezing, the fire having died out hours ago. She dragged herself up and decided to do a proper assessment of her $1 empire. By daylight, the assay office was even more intimidating. An assay office, she recalled from a fleeting high school history lesson, was where miners brought their ore back in the late 1800s. The assayer would chemically test the rock to determine its purity and value, essentially acting as the gold and silver standard for the entire region. The building was split into three main areas: the front customer counter, the middle laboratory where the smelting and testing happened, and a reinforced back room that served as the vault. It was in this back room that Evelyn's life would irrevocably change. The doorway to the vault room was blocked by a collapsed section of the ceiling. It took Evelyn 3 hours of grueling, splinter-inducing labor to drag the heavy beams and plaster out of the way. When she finally cleared a path and stepped into the dim, windowless space, the air felt tangibly heavier. There, sitting in the center of the room like a dormant iron beast, was a massive Mosler double-door safe. It was nearly 6 feet tall, painted a chipped, fading black with intricate, hand-painted gold pinstriping that was barely visible under decades of grime. The hinges were as thick as her wrists. In the center of the right door was a heavy brass combination dial, oxidized to a dull green. Evelyn approached it slowly, placing her bare hand against the cold steel. It felt immovable, permanent. She grabbed the heavy handle and yanked. It didn't budge a millimeter. She tried spinning the dial. It let out a sharp metallic screech but refused to turn smoothly. Why would a safe this massive be left behind? She spent the rest of the day cleaning the office, searching for anything of value she could pawn for food. She found old glass vials, a few heavy iron crucibles, and rusted tools, but nothing substantial. Yet, her mind kept returning to the Mosler. The next morning, Evelyn walked into town. She managed to secure a part-time job washing dishes at the Copper Diner in exchange for minimum wage and one hot meal a day. On her first break, she visited the Creed Historical Archive, a dusty room attached to the local library. She was greeted by Tobias Miller, a man in his late 50s with thick glasses and a passion for local lore that bordered on obsession. The Silver Queen assay office? Tobias's eyes lit up when Evelyn asked. Oh, that's a tragedy, that is, built in 1890. The chief assayer was a man named Elias Harding, brilliant chemist, but deeply paranoid. He operated the office until the silver panic of 1893. What happened in 1893? Evelyn asked, leaning over the counter. The bottom fell out of the silver market, Tobias explained, pulling out a heavy, leather-bound volume. Overnight, millionaires became paupers. Panic swept through the mountains. Miners tried to liquidate everything they had. Legend has it that in the weeks leading up to the crash, several of the richest mine owners brought their raw silver ingots to Harding for safekeeping, trusting his vault over the local banks. Evelyn's breath hitched. And on a Tuesday in October of 1893, Elias Harding simply vanished, Tobias said, lowering his voice for dramatic effect. Just walked out into a blizzard and was never seen again. The banks seized the property years later, eventually auctioning it off to the Pendleton family, but Harding's main vault was found completely empty. Wait, Evelyn frowned. Empty? But there's a giant Mosler safe still sitting in the back room. Tobias chuckled. Oh, the decoy safe. Yes, the bank liquidators noted that. They brought in a safecracker from Denver in 1901. He drilled it, opened it up, and found nothing but old ledgers and dust. The real treasure, the hoarded silver ingots, was never found. People assume Harding smuggled it out of town before he disappeared. Evelyn walked back to the assay office that night, her mind racing. A decoy safe? She stepped into the back room and stared at the rusting behemoth. Tobias had said the safecracker drilled it. She fetched her flashlight and examined the face of the safe closely. She ran her fingers over the cold iron, checking the edges of the doors, the hinges, and the area around the dial. Nothing. There were no drill holes. Her heart began to pound against her ribs. Safecrackers in the early 1900s didn't have magical techniques to seal cast iron. If they drilled the safe, there would be a plug or a scar in the metal. The safe standing in front of her was completely pristine, save for rust and age. Tobias's history books were wrong. They had drilled a safe, but not this one. Adrenaline surged through her veins. But how could she open a locked century-old Mosler? She couldn't afford a locksmith, and she certainly couldn't let anyone in town know that the safe had never been breached. She needed the combination. Evelyn tore through the assay office with renewed, manic energy. She pulled up loose floorboards, checked behind the peeling Victorian wallpaper, and emptied every rotted drawer in the front room. By 2 a.m., covered in soot and sweat, she sat on the floor, exhausted and defeated. She looked over at the heavy cast-iron wood stove. The fire was dying down. She grabbed the iron poker to stir the embers. As she jabbed at the back of the stove, the poker hit something with a dull, hollow clink. She paused. The back wall of the firebox wasn't solid cast iron like the rest of the stove. It was a secondary, inserted plate. Waiting agonizingly for the fire to die and the stove to cool, Evelyn wrapped her hands in an old burlap sack and reached into the soot. She pried at the false back plate. It resisted, wedged tight by decades of ash. But with a sharp pull of the poker, the plate snapped forward. Behind the firebox, insulated from the heat, was a small, hidden cavity. Evelyn reached inside. Her fingers brushed against cold metal and brittle paper. She pulled out a tarnished brass key, completely unlike the one Arthur had given her for the front door. Accompanying it was a small, soot-stained, leather-bound notebook. With trembling hands, she cracked the notebook open. The pages were brittle, filled with elegant, sloping handwriting. It was Elias Harding's personal log. Most of the pages detailed mundane chemical formulas and weights, but the very last page was different. It wasn't a formula. It was a schematic drawing of the Mosler safe's dial, followed by a sequence of numbers, heavily underlined. 42, le, Suten, R, 609, L, fire, R. And beneath the numbers, written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl, was a warning. The silver is heavy, but the blood is heavier. Let the devil take the man who turns the dial without the pin. Evelyn stared at the words. The combination was right here in her hands. But what did Harding mean by the pin? And more importantly, what was really waiting for her behind those 6-inch steel doors? For 2 agonizing days, Evelyn stared at Elias Harding's journal and the rusted Mosler safe, effectively trapped in a high-stakes escape room where the penalty for losing was freezing to death on the street. The silver is heavy, but the blood is heavier. Let the devil take the man who turns the dial without the pin. The words mocked her. Safe-cracking wasn't a matter of brute force. It was a symphony of mechanics. She had the combination, but turning the dial without understanding the pin could trigger a secondary internal lockout, a common feature in high-end 19th century bank safes designed to permanently jam the locking bolts if tampered with. If she messed this up, the doors would seal forever, requiring industrial diamond drills and tens of thousands of dollars she didn't possess. She turned her attention back to the tarnished brass key she had found hidden behind the wood stove. It was incredibly strange. It didn't have the traditional jagged teeth of a standard door key. Instead, the shaft was perfectly round, smooth, and abnormally long, ending in a distinct, star-shaped tip. It looked less like a key and more like a mechanical firing pin for an artillery shell. The pin. Evelyn grabbed a rag, dipped it in a mixture of melted snow and vinegar, and began furiously scrubbing the front of the Mosler safe. She worked her way around the massive iron hinges, the combination dial, and the gold leaf pinstriping. It took an hour of scraping through a century of grease and oxidization before she found it. Directly beneath the heavy brass combination dial, camouflaged flawlessly within the intricate floral casting of the safe's decorative faceplate, was a tiny, perfectly circular hole. It was no wider than a pencil. Her hands trembling, Evelyn picked up the strange brass key. She slid the long needle-like shaft into the hidden hole. It went in deep, nearly 4 inches, before hitting a point of resistance. She took a breath, pushed inward, and gave it a quarter turn, clockwise. From deep inside the belly of the iron beast, a heavy, resonating clack echoed through the empty room. A secondary locking bar had just dropped. She had disarmed the trap. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the freezing temperature of the room. She reached up and gripped the cold brass dial. 42. L. She spun the dial left, passing 423 times before stopping dead on the number on the 4th rotation. 17. R. She reversed direction, turning right, passing 17 twice before stopping on the 3rd rotation. 89. L. Left again, passing 89 once, stopping on the 2nd rotation. 04. R. A final slow turn to the right, stopping precisely on 04. She held her breath and grasped the massive iron lever on the right door. She leaned her entire body weight backward, pulling with every ounce of strength her 19-year-old frame could muster. With a horrific, groaning screech of rusted metal giving way, the heavy right door cracked open. A rush of stale, metallic-smelling air untouched since the silver panic of 1893 washed over her face. She pulled the left door open next. Evelyn shined her flashlight into the dark cavern of the safe. What she saw brought her to her knees. It wasn't a decoy. Tobias Miller's history books were completely wrong. Elias Harding hadn't smuggled his fortune out of Creed. He had sealed it in the one place no one would look, behind a false back wall in his own vault. Stacked neatly on the reinforced steel shelves were rows upon rows of dull, tarnished blocks. She reached out and pulled one of the blocks into the light. It was incredibly heavy, roughly the size of a thick paperback book. Wiping away the dust, she saw the stamp pressed deep into the metal. Creed, Mining, Co. 999 fine silver. 100 Troy Oz. She sat back, doing the frantic math in her head. There were dozens of these bars. Nearly $250,000 in raw, unregistered bullion. It was enough to buy her life back. It was enough to never need Richard Preston's money again. But it was the rusted tin lockbox on the bottom shelf that would give her the power to destroy him. Evelyn pried the tin box open with a flathead screwdriver. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of heavy yellowed parchment documents. They bore the official seal of the United States General Land Office, dated 1891, and were signed by President Benjamin Harrison. They were original, unencumbered federal land patents. During the Panic of 1893, when the miners were fleeing the mountains and abandoning their claims, Elias Harding hadn't just hoarded their silver. He had used his position as the town's financial arbiter to quietly buy up the foundational land deeds to the entire Creed Basin for pennies on the dollar. Evelyn read through the boundaries described in the ornate calligraphy. Harding didn't just own the assay office. According to these federal patents, which legally superseded any modern municipal zoning or county claims, the owner of these papers held the absolute title and mineral rights to the entire northern commercial district of the Brang town, including the exact 600-acre parcel that Mayor Higgins was actively trying to seize for a multi-million-dollar luxury ski resort redevelopment. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Evelyn's face. She knew her father's business. She knew how corporate real estate acquisitions worked. A town doesn't bulldoze historic properties for a massive resort unless they already have a corporate buyer lined up. She looked at the silver. Then, she looked at the deeds. She wasn't just a 19-year-old outcast anymore. She was the most powerful person in Creed, Colorado. Friday morning arrived with a bitter, biting wind. It was 9 a.m., the exact hour the county clerk's office opened, and the exact deadline for the $4,000 in back taxes owed on the Silver Queen Assay office. Evelyn stood by the wood stove, wearing a newly purchased, tailored wool coat. Thursday had been a busy day. She had enlisted Arthur Pendleton's help, swearing him to secrecy, to drive her and 2 of the heavy silver bars to a high-end bullion broker in Durango. She walked out with $60,000 in a cashier's check and a verified appraisal. At 9:15 a.m., the heavy wooden doors of the assay office were kicked open. Mayor Higgins, a red-faced man who looked like his blood pressure was constantly on the verge of a critical event, marched into the room. He was flanked by Sheriff Davis, and a tall, impeccably dressed man in a charcoal cashmere suit. "All right, Arthur, the deadline is passed. I told you I'd bring the sheriff to evict." Higgins stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the 19-year-old girl standing calmly in the center of the room. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the property owner," Evelyn said smoothly. The man in the cashmere suit stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Evelyn recognized him instantly. Harrison Gallagher, the ruthless vice president of acquisitions for Preston Holdings, her father's right-hand man. Harrison's jaw dropped. "Evelyn, what in God's name are you doing here? Your father has a private investigator looking for you in California." "Hello, Harrison," Evelyn smiled politely. "I assume you're here to close the purchase agreement with the city for the Northern Commercial District? The proposed site for the new Preston Alpine Lodge?" Mayor Higgins looked wildly between the two of them. "You know each other?" "She's Richard Preston's daughter," Harrison muttered, visibly thrown off balance. He quickly recovered his corporate composure. "Evelyn, this is absurd. This building has been condemned. The city seized it this morning for delinquent taxes. Preston Holdings has already wired the escrow funds to bulldoze this entire block." "Did they?" Evelyn walked over to the makeshift counter and slid a piece of paper across the wood. It was a time-stamped receipt from the county clerk's office, dated today at 8:01 a.m. Taxes paid in full, $4,000. Payer, Evelyn Preston. "The taxes are paid," Evelyn stated, her voice echoing like a gunshot in the dusty room. "You can't seize the property, Mayor Higgins. It belongs to me." Higgins's face turned a violent shade of purple. "You little brat. It doesn't matter. The city council has already drafted an eminent domain claim. This building is a toxic hazard. We will seize it for the public good, pay you a fraction of the land value, and proceed with the Preston Holdings development. You can't stop progress." Harrison smirked, adjusting his tie. "He's right, Evelyn. Your father taught you better than this. You can't fight a multi-billion-dollar real estate firm and a municipal government with one rundown shack. Take a buyout and go home." "I think you misunderstand the situation, Harrison," Evelyn said, her tone dropping into a dead, terrifying calm that perfectly mirrored her father's boardroom voice. She reached behind the counter and produced a thick manila envelope. She pulled out the 1,891 federal land patents, newly authenticated and notarized by a title attorney in Durango the previous afternoon. "I didn't just buy this building to save it," Evelyn explained, laying the ancient, heavy parchment on the counter. "When I purchased the assay office from Arthur Pendleton via quitclaim, I purchased the entirety of the estate. And what Mayor Higgins failed to realize during his illegal zoning crusade is that the original assayer, Elias Harding, held the underlying allodial patents to this entire valley." Harrison Gallagher stepped forward, his eyes scanning the documents. The color completely drained from his face. These are original federal patents," Harrison whispered, his corporate bravado shattering. Evelyn tapped the paper. "They grant the bearer absolute title and mineral rights to the Canyon Creek tract, which means, Mayor Higgins, you don't own the Northern Commercial District. The city doesn't own it. I own it. You have been illegally leasing land that belongs to this estate for decades." Higgins sputtered, taking a step back. That's impossible. That can't hold up in court. I have $250,000 in liquid silver assets to fund the litigation," Evelyn lied smoothly, inflating the number just enough to terrify them. "Any title company in America will put a hard stop on Preston Holdings development the second these patents are filed. Your ski resort project is dead, Harrison. Unless, of course, you negotiate with the legal landowner." Harrison swallowed hard. Millions of dollars in non-refundable environmental studies, architectural plans, and investor capital had already been sunk into this location by Preston Holdings. If the land deal fell through, it would be a catastrophic financial blow to her father's company. "What do you want, Evelyn?" Harrison asked, his voice tight with defeat. Evelyn looked around the ruined, beautiful assay office that had given her shelter when her own blood had thrown her away. "First, Preston Holdings will abandon the resort project. You will publicly withdraw from Creed. Second, Mayor Higgins will resign by Monday, or I will file federal fraud charges against the city for selling leases on private land. Third, tell my father that the daughter he threw away just checkmated him with a $1 bill." She looked Harrison dead in the eye. "Now, get off my property." Within a week, the news broke. Preston Holdings suffered a massive stock dip due to the collapse of their flagship Colorado development. Mayor Higgins quietly resigned, citing health reasons. As for Evelyn Preston, she didn't return to Boston high society. She stayed in Creed. Using the silver from Elias Harding's hidden vault, she completely restored the Silver Queen Assay Office, turning it into a thriving historical museum and community foundation. She had arrived in town as a discarded, penniless girl, but she remained as the undisputed queen of the mountain, a self-made titan who built her empire on a bed of forgotten silver and a dollar bill. Sometimes, the greatest treasures aren't just buried in the ground, they are hidden in the courage of those who refuse to stay defeated. Evelyn's journey from a discarded daughter to a real estate titan proves that resilience is the ultimate currency. If her incredible story of revenge, historical secrets, and a $1 gamble inspired you, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable real-life stories.
Hi, my name is Kwang Vin, the owner and manager of Royal Whispers. After watching the video, Cast Out at 19, she paid $1 for a forgotten assay office. What she found in the safe changed everything. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the strongest feeling was determination. Watching someone face rejection and uncertainty, yet continue moving forward, makes the story feel both engaging and rewarding. The discovery may be exciting, but what really stood out to me was the courage it took to keep going when there were no guarantees. One gentle lesson I took from this story is that opportunity sometimes hides in places others have overlooked. In our own lives, it can be worth giving a second look to something people dismiss too quickly. What moment surprised you the most? And do you think her success came more from luck or from her willingness to take a chance when no one else would? Thank you for spending time with Royal Whispers. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and maybe like or subscribe for more stories about resilience, unexpected discoveries, and turning setbacks into new beginnings.